Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Cradle conversation. My name is Laura Halpin. I use she, her pronouns, and I am recording from my home in Walnut Creek, California, which is on the stolen land of the Bay Miwoks. And before I introduce my guests, I just wanted to welcome Kate Amoo-Gottfried here. Welcome.
Thank you.
So good to have you.
It's so good to be here.
So Kate and I have known one another for, for almost a year now.
Yes, good anniversary.
Yeah, and the reason we know one another through Julie Neal, who was a previous Cradle Conversation guest. And Kate Amoo-Gottfried is an activist in the South Bay in San Mateo County and has been working to support the family of Chinedu Akobi, who was a Black man living with a mental illness and was tased to death by the San Mateo
Sheriff's Department.
Sheriff's Department. Okay.
Yeah.
And so when my neighbor Miles Hall was shot and killed, my first connection through Julie brought me to Kate, and Kate was an amazing support for the Justice for Miles Hall efforts. In the very, very beginning, she really held us and guided us and sent us links, and so I am forever grateful to have you have that support and get to know you in that way, Kate.
Yeah, it was, I think, the most horrific of circumstances that brought us together. But I think as we get to know each other more personally and on these journeys of activism, I think maybe you and I are both relatively new stepping into these roles, and it can be scary and intimidating. There's a lot of knowledge, information to gather, but then just a lot of self-reflection and examination to figure out how to show up, and in what capacity. So I've learned a lot, lessons I wasn't necessarily prepared for or looking to take on, but feel just imperative. And I would say my connection, it feels very urgent, as it does for many people, but by way of background, I'm married to a large Black man, Kofi, and we have two mixed race, biracial sons. And seeing what happens to Black men in America, makes it feel just deeply urgent, where I needed to gather tons of information, but also gather people, and like-minded people, and that there may not be there's definitely not one way to show up, not one way to be part of it, but we need all the voices, and yeah, we need it to be a collective.
One of the things that I have really appreciated about your modeling for me is how much you have stayed with the just tracking the movements and the progress and the lack of progress in the San Mateo Sheriff's Department. And I think that kind of careful tracking has been really helpful and is really kind of the antithesis of what we often see in social media, where there's like that immediate uproar, which is, perfectly appropriate, but then the media goes away and the attention goes away. And so I really appreciated how you modeled just kind of staying local and tracking tracking progress and lack of progress, and that kind of tenacity, I think, is really important. And, the other thing that I know about you is that you are in the very active throes of mothering young boys. And I think it's so important to me that I'm connecting with all kinds of people, and not necessarily because of their professional lens, but just whatever is their current identity, or what's capturing your attention and your efforts. And what I know about you is that you are a very thoughtful and deliberate parent, and I see you really reaching out for resources and sharing resources. And I wondered if you would just share a little bit about your parenting journey right now, which is full-time plus, right?
Yes. I think that's a wonderful place to start. So I really appreciate the question. It was not pretty at the start of this pandemic. My oldest son is a little over 6, and I have a 4.5-year-old. Marlo is my oldest, and Miles. And so over the course of the last 6 years, Marlo, my oldest, was born in London. We moved to New York, bought a house, sold a house, moved to California. December, we moved from Half Moon Bay on the coast to Redwood City in order to be closer to both my children's schools. Mm-hmm. So I think I've been on a 6-year journey of a lot of transition and upheaval. Wow. And so personally, I've been looking for identity and connection and lots of things outside of being mom. And so when I say the beginning of the pandemic wasn't pretty, there was a bit of, honestly, panic in me that the bits of time that I've carefully carved out for advocacy or self-care, or all those things just went poof. And I really struggle to do those things side by side with my kids. It's possible, and we could talk, I'm finding those ways. But like I said, there was a moment of panic, but I also know that I feel really awful when I'm trying to multitask. And if I've got my cell phone out and my kids are getting louder and bigger and more irritated, to be honest, with my lack of attention, it doesn't lead to good places. And so I've trying to find the connections, the places where I'm really in tune with them. And I can't say I'm not giving up on broader identity, but I also know that we're in this time and place. It's a season, not to make it all pretty. It's not pretty. But I also know it's a phase or stage or season that will move on. And we can sort of sow seeds now. And so when I was thinking about this conversation today, I've been thinking a lot about those connections between the micro and the macro, about systems, about change, but also in our personal life. So those deep, close interpersonal relationships, and how what we do in those relationships maps to some of those broader changes that we might want to see in the world. Maybe that's all this cognitive justification that I need. But I feel like it's been a real eye-opener on so many fronts, this whole crisis. And I think I was already on the path to try and find this more organic way of being, that my pre-child life of corporate, well, America, but other countries as well, but generally this, very demanding career focus. There were parts of me that thought, I will go back to that. But it wasn't serving me before kids. And I don't think I see even more conflict having a family. And so trying to reconcile all those pieces has been part of this very slowly evolving process. And I'm starting to see the organic roots of some of the more, I won't say vocational, because I'm not paid for some of the advocacy, but things that maybe appeal to my brain and make me feel involved or connected beyond just motherhood, although that's at the root of all of it.
I want to, as Rachel Maddow says, put a pin in that for later.
Okay.
Yeah, but through the cradle questions that might come up again. Yeah. But I'm interested in the micro and the macro. You know, what are you cultivating here that you see affecting or playing at the macro level? So,
yeah.
All right. So, you know, given how really consumed you are in parenting, and there really isn't, there aren't breaks possible. Given all the uncertainty, I am so curious about what cradles you.
So the first answer, I had three things on my mind. And the first was my kids. And that might be totally counterintuitive. Maybe it's the word cradle that comes to mind, but so we've moved countries and cultures. I've thought a lot about, my own identity and where that comes from. And the constant drum of needs and routine is actually an incredibly stabilizing factor. So I have something that needs tending every single day, every minute. And I find a lot of purpose in that. And none of that has changed. It was some of our day-to-day and the logistics look different, but I'm also finding comfort in the routines, pulling out the cereal bowls every morning, the bedtime routines that we have, those natural rhythms of the day are really grounding. And I'm finding tools that I use for my kids. One of my biggest lessons is that I will it's sort of like put the mask on yourself before helping others. All these tools that I use with my kids can be applied to me. And it took my own therapist pointing out some of these things to me. And I suppose it's an important part of the conversation that my older son, Marlo, is autistic. And so there are some really specific tools and strategies that we use with him to ground his body and keep him regulated throughout the day, paying attention to a lot of sensory needs that I think about for him and I forget about for myself. And so through my kids and all those, if I can remember, I have all those tools for them. I just need to apply them to myself. The two others I'll really brief.
We're good.
I think is being in my body. So I think many people have said getting out in nature, and that absolutely those walks in any kind of natural setting, or it's a quiet room, but finding this time and space to be in my body and connect with my body is, was always necessary, but it's critical now. And the third piece is I've recognized this need for art and poetry and dance that feels critical. It was a nice to have before, but it's cradling, it's sustaining now. I think your very first guest was Jenna Schwartz, and she offered a poem, and I go back to that all the time. I've also, Alvin Ailey opened up a lot of performances and also access to dance classes. And I've been doing it with my kids. I had my boys dancing to Revelations and it's actually been one of the highlights of this whole crisis. And so finding the things that brought me a lot of pleasure and being able to share them with my kids and having the time and space to enjoy them together has been, cradling, but I think a memory that we'll take from this time, a positive memory to take from this time.
I was thinking when you were talking about, I think it was from like Stephen Covey years ago, but the whole concept of what is urgent versus what is important, you know, and that so often we get caught up in the urgent and we forget what's important.
Yes.
And I feel like a lot of the things that have been important, not urgent, like dance and art and being out in nature and, you know, not multitasking have become almost urgent in their importance right now, you know?
Yes. Yes.
And so that's what I kept thinking of when you were offering all of those three things, is that like there's no question, like they're not optional anymore in a way, you know,
Yes.
um, as much as we can access them, you know, depending upon where we're at. But yeah, thank you so much. And I love that. What I really appreciate you saying, and I just admire this, is that I think it would be so easy. You know, my kids are so much older than yours, and I feel like there was so much of parenting that I resisted, like the slowness of parenting
Mm.
was really, really hard for me. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I don't think that I'm strange in that.
No.
But, you know, I think that that's probably so much the challenge of parenting young kids right now in this pandemic. But I think it's also interesting that you're just kind of like moving into it and appreciating that that's also what's holding you steady.
Mm-hmm. When I resist it, when I'm looking for something outside of it, the tension mounts in so many ways. Inside me, it mounts for my kids. And so there's a word that Kofi and I had before becoming parents. We were in those prenatal groups, and they asked, kind of think of a word for this parenting journey. And we decided on surrender. And I cannot tell you how often I come back to that and how it served me. We had an incredibly traumatic first birth, and I didn't know at the time how much I needed that word. And so I find myself coming back to it over and over and over again. And, you know, there's so much to fight for. And I embrace the word not as kind of giving up. But we can have agency in so many ways. But finding, I use the word organic, or finding some ease has served me so much better than those when there's the tension, right? When I'm fighting it, and the slowness, or my two kids are tying my hands behind my back. I can't be productive, right? There's been tons of articles published in this time around productivity and our need that it's very American part of our culture. And I'm just seeing it show up more and more and more and more. And I keep going back to the surrender part.
Yeah.
And so surrendering to this time, and to the relationship that I have with my kids, and really being present with them is a privilege. I realize many people don't have that privilege, but to be able to find ease and really try and surrender into, this is where I'm at this stage, at this time, and being present with them serves them, but I'm also finding many ways in which it's serving me.
I think that those like mantras or intentions that, you know, you and your husband chose that, but there's something about that word that chose you, you know?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of those. This is really just delightful. I'm so happy that we're talking. So the second question is, do you have a cradle to offer?
So funny, these S words. And I hadn't thought of that surrender word until this conversation. But I had two other S words I've been thinking about and to offer. And the first one is scaffolding. So when I was talking about the tools, particularly with Marlo, my son who's autistic, I think about a very early experience in school. It was preschool, and his preschool teacher was becoming frustrated with his inability to use a scissors. And I said, wait, back up. Like, he's in occupational therapy. We're not even at the stage of using the scissors. Scissors is actually quite a complicated skill developmentally. And you've jumped a bunch of other steps. Mm-hmm. But finding scaffolding is a real skill. Breaking down any of our problems is a real skill. So it can be as simple as the mechanics of using a scissors, but there are developmental steps before we get to even using the scissors. And so thanks to our wonderful OT, I brought a pack of resources, and at age 2, 3, 4, really around age 3 at the time, kids should be tearing paper, right? It's a bilateral action. We've got to use 2 hands together to tear paper. And if they can't tear paper, we shouldn't be cutting. Scissors is next rung up the ladder. And she said, you know what? I tried the class, half the class couldn't tear paper. And so she was growing in this frustration of, scissor use, which is an important pre-kindergarten kind of skill that she really wanted everyone to learn, but she was growing frustrated. I believe young people are super intuitive, so not a great place to be. And we needed to break it down. And so this idea of scaffolding is one that I come back to and think about often. And it's a little bit the macro micro for me as well, that there's what feels like intractable problems if we talk about race relations and policing, and it feels insurmountable. But we're breaking it down. And so sometimes I maybe lose the forest and the trees. But you were, I guess, reflecting back about tracking those details, those incremental changes, where social movements come from, finding those roots and those tiny incremental steps that are forgotten in the end. When we tell the tale about Rosa Parks, we forgot all the steps beforehand. And so I think about scaffolding both as a tool for me, but in also how we think about the world or how we got to here. We gloss over so many of those micro steps, and they're all critical steps in the path. We can't skip over the tearing the paper on our way to being able to use the scissors.
Damn it. We so want to. We want to go straight to the giant paper cutter.
Yes.
So it's so interesting that you say scaffolding, because I'm wondering, like, I'm a former teacher. And so my brain always goes to, you just break it down into smaller skills. And I'm wondering, do you have a teaching background, or was it through parenting Marlo that you had to look at that kind of breaking down?
I think probably started before Marlo. I am not a teacher. I'm not an occupational therapist, but I was familiar enough with some of the concepts. So my own mother is a teacher, and moved into special ed. I have a sister who I'm 10 years older than. So our sibling relationship is a little bit different, and she really struggled in school, has dyslexia. And so my mom, who understood early childhood education, thought she knew a lot about teaching reading and early reading, was totally stumped with my sister, and had to go much deeper into figuring out how to teach reading. And this scaffolding approach is super important. I think the other concept along with that serves me and I come back to is that, particularly related to any kind of disability, is a universal approach, right? We can all use a ramp. We can't all use stairs, but we can all use a ramp. A lot of the methods that work for teaching reading to students with dyslexia or any other learning difference, when it's universal, there are ways to teach that everyone can access. And so I'm really, I think, being the parent to Marlo now, attuned to more of those elements in our society, and in thinking about how we break things down or how we solve a problem, that those universal solutions are golden.
Love that. Okay, so what cradles you are your kids, those rhythms of your day, being in your body, especially out in nature, and art, poetry, and dance. And really, like that whole word, a concept of surrender came up in that cradling of you. And the cradle that you offered is just that concept of scaffolding, which I love, just because I think that, again, there's a tendency to look for the grand end result, the moment where the scales tipped. And what you're talking about is just that appreciation for the incremental that I think that we just so don't want to slow down and pay attention to and work on that level. And so I'm wondering, is there anything that you think that we could practice?
Now, I thought about this. Yeah. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about, this is the other S word, is about sustainability. And so I don't know, that's something we practice on the call, but it's something that I'm thinking about in life in general. And that what makes up a life, what is sustainable over the long term. And I think it comes a lot back to my own grappling with my own role in the world, trying to find that ease in where I am at this stage. And I think there's a slowness and a stillness in a pandemic that a lot of us are uncomfortable with. And it's a forced stillness and slowness. Getting out of the busyness of life forces a lot of reflection. And I think it's raised questions for many people, or it certainly has in my household, about what is sustainable for us. And one of the other, I guess it was an article I read about retirement and people being so unhappy in retirement that you lead this life of busyness or a professional calling, and then all of a sudden it stops. Obviously, a pandemic is not retirement, but we've had this sort of forced stop. We don't have all these activities to be rushing to. And so I think it's sort of forced a reckoning. I'll speak for myself about, is this life of ours, our day-to-day activities, how is this going to be sustainable? And so I think there's value in those things that come slowly, that come maybe a little bit more organically. I personally have felt this push or rush to, I want to join an institution of some sort. I need formal work. I need someone else coming up with the structure. And it's been my resistance to the organic and the slow. I want to slot in. I want to feel really productive and have this big impact. And my ego gets larger than life. And if I can let go of some of that, actually find things that are much more sustainable, that probably are I don't know if it's intuitive, but just it's more grounded. It's come from organic places. It's not forced. It's not constructed, but likely will be here after that institution goes away, after that job isn't part of my life anymore. It's the sustainable aspect. So when I think about an offering for the collective is just that time to reflect about what practices in our lives, what people in our lives are sustainable, not only for this season or moment in time, but things that we need to carry with us.
James Olivia Chukaman. There are two questions about figuring out if you're in right relationship with, whether it's your job or another person. Is there room for you, and is it sustainable? And I think those questions are so anchoring. Like, is this sustainable over the long haul? Is so much a question that we don't really ask ourselves. Like, can I keep this up? What will happen? What will happen if I keep this up?
Yes.
Yeah.
I definitely took shaped my thinking a lot of your conversation with Desiree Lynn Attaway. And there were two elements. One, she talked about transactional relationships, and the other piece about accountability. And I took that and thought about my parenting relationship, thought about many parenting relationships, and that I won't say people are transactional with their kids, but I do think there's a lot of models about behavior management or discipline that are transactional, and we teach, consequences, action, and a consequence for particularly if it's a negative behavior. But we need to, that I again, taking from particularly my autistic son, is the behavior, all behavior is communication. And that a lot of those other models don't serve us, that if we think about the behavior as communication, we're going to learn a lot more. Particularly, there's a lot of different schools of thought around autism, but I've liked an approach that really looked at all behaviors as strategies, coping mechanisms, and playing detective. So one very strange example, my son Marlo, for about 3 months was Brittany. And he was Brittany from Alvin and the Chipmunks. Brittany is one of the 3 Chipettes. And, he corrected every adult, every teacher, every child that he was Brittany. He would not go by Marlo, and was quite upset if anyone called him Marlo. So he had a Brittany costume. That was who he was. It was around August, September, October time. So he was Brittany for Halloween. And we tried to have conversations about what that was about. Is this gender? What does this all look like? But he was more a chipmunk than it wasn't the gender piece. He was a different species. So now I can kind of laugh about it. In the middle of it, I was like, what is this? This is hard. We've started new preschool. We're meeting new people. He was getting more independent about introducing himself. Having a pretend name allowed him to call mom into the conversation. Mom, can you tell them my pretend name? And I figured my detective was that it was a strategy. It was a coping mechanism for Marlo that he wasn't quite ready to be independent in introducing himself. It was also a way to test new adults. So a therapist or a new teacher, are you gonna compromise with me? Will you play along? How flexible are you going to be? And I don't know if my conclusions about his strategies are true or not. We will never know. But playing detective allowed me to think about some of the roots, maybe it's scaffolding, and his incredible ingenuity to come up with these strategies. They may not all be socially acceptable all the time, but if I don't fight his strategy, his behavior, and I try and figure out what is at the root of it, what is he trying to solve for, and maybe I can offer some additional tools that might help us solve that problem. It's a much better way of being in the world, and it's sustainable.
It requires surrender.
And we're surrendered. Yeah. And I've surrendered. So when if we don't fight it, and we allow put on our detective hats, we can find some of the roots to that. So I was thinking about it related to Desiree's comments is also this accountability piece. And I think with my kids, she talked a lot about the I'm sorry. And I was just giggling about that. Now tell them you're sorry. How many times a day do I say those words? But we love Fred Rogers and Daniel Tiger in our house. And we don't just say, I'm sorry in my house, but we say, and how can I make it better? And on the macro level, it's how do we make people whole? So, and as Desiree talked about, it's the impact that we have on somebody else. So I think about, again, trying to tie it back to the macro, micro,
thank you.
That some of my advocacy or structural changes, systemic changes that I want to see in the world start at home. Mm-hmm. So when I'm fighting my role in my household and in my family, and always looking for something outside of it, I'm not serving us. My kids see that. Being in relationship with them in the stage that we are, and being present for them helps keep them whole, and helps, I think, in these parenting ideas, not being transactional with them, with, it's not just action consequences, but I'm going to stay listening to you. Their ways of being in the world as adults could be transformational, that we are not in transactional relationships with people, and that starts at home, and it starts from a very, very young age. So back to that sustainability, that these grand concepts and ways of being and macro changes that we want to see in the world, we have to apply them to micro. It's back to the scaffolding. It's the first rung on the ladder, that if we're not in right relationship in our own homes with our own kids, it manifests in so many ways outside of the home and in the structures that we create in the world.
Can you imagine what it would be like to have someone who's wronged you or caused you harm say not only I'm sorry, but what did you say? How can I make it better? Mm-hmm. Like, what would that mean? And I think it's such a profound second question, mm-hmm. or the first question, I am sorry. How can I make it better? Is such a, that's something beautiful to practice,
Yes.
Yeah. How can I make it better? And also, I think sitting with the pain of not always being able to make something better,
Mm. Yeah. I've not turned this into my own therapy session, but I think a lot about, I can't fix everything for Marlo in the world. I am not always going to be there to help him with his introduction, trying to build his, independence in the world is something, it's really scary to me, and for many reasons, but I think, I'm at this age still an intermediary. I help translate the world for him and translate Marlo to the world. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so I have to figure out how to find the places to be independent, and cut some of those strings. But right now I can help figure out what's at the root of it.
And I think, him having those experiences where his ingenuity or his creativity is welcomed and validated. You know, even in this space, you could bring all of you, you know, and that's one of the things that I tell my son a lot is, you know, there's room for all of you in this family.
Yes.
You know, and God give us the scaffolding to have the skills, you know, to welcome it all. But I just think that there's that spaciousness that you're providing, I think will give him a lot of strength. You know. Yeah. So the last question is there a vision or blessing you have for the collective?
Maybe this is a little more the practice than the blessing, but it's a mantra. It's something that it came from Marlowe's school. He practices yoga at school, so it's a tool from my 6-year-old that has been. So back to the start of this conversation, that my kids are providing me all kinds of tools and grounding, and it's that routine and ritual that cradles me. And the words from Marlowe that we say every night at bedtime, we could say together or use it whenever you need in the day. But it's, again, I find profound things in the simple things. So the words are, and he says it and we repeat after him. So maybe you can do it with me. I'll say the words and you repeat. I am calm.
I am calm.
I am joy.
I am joy.
I am peace.
I am peace.
I am enough.
I am enough.
Just to be me.
Just to be me.
Just to be here.
Just to be here.
I am more than enough.
I am more than enough.
I had a lot of tears the first time he said it. He loves a script, so it's something that is really grounding for him, but very meaningful. And it's a practice that I'm glad to say that we've adopted, and it's part of our bedtime routine. But if I get out of my annoyed space and would you please just go to sleep, and really let the words fall and settle, it's a really pretty perfect way to end our day every day.
Yes. Thank you so much. I'm going to write that down and put it in our comments. That is amazing. Thank you so much for that. And you know, I forgot that usually in the beginning of our conversation, I like to call everyone close. And before we started today, we did a grounding meditation where we imagined our roots intertwining, and you brought in the image of redwoods in a circle, and it's called a cathedral.
Yes, I believe so. Maybe an arborist can correct us.
Yeah. And so I just want to call everyone who's watching to come close and to feel the protection and the connection and the resilience that comes from standing together and cultivating practices that are sustainable, and the invitation to be human with one another through scaffolding, you know, starting with where we're at and building skills from there. I just so appreciate. So thank you so much for joining us. And Kate, thank you so much for such a thoughtful and beautiful conversation.
Thank you, Laura. I really appreciate this collective that you're creating so deeply, and I am so just grateful to be part of it. So thank you for the time.
So thankful to have your friendship.
Yours too.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.